Good afternoon, or at least good afternoon to those who are in our time zone. It's a great pleasure to be hosting today's lecture by Professor Nicholas Perkins. He's going to be speaking about gifts and books from early myths to the present. My name is Robert Verlaine. I'm the senior tutor of St Hugh's, and in another life, I'm also an academic in a literary field, so I'm particularly keen to hear what Nick has to say. It is absolutely tremendous to see so many members of the St Hugh's community from right across the world joining us today as we relaunch our online lecture series. As I say, it's lunchtime here. It may be breakfast time for you or dinner time, or maybe even the middle of the night, but we're delighted to see you here. Throughout our online lecture series, we're trying to bring you a taste of the fantastic research that fellows and lecturers of the college are engaged in. We have a flourishing academic community across a whole host of disciplines, and absolutely everybody is active and engaged in research. And we're trying this year and next year and the year after to bring a full programme of events that show you a range of what we're doing. If you were very lucky enough to visit Nick's exhibition at the Western Library last year, again entitled Gifts and Books, you will know, as I do, that we are in for a real treat in the next hour. Nick is going to share some highlights from his work on that exhibition, and it'll give us an insight into his research work in the background to that curation. By the end of this talk, I'm absolutely sure that those of you who have not already laid your hands on a copy of the book that comes with that exhibition will want to buy it. The Bodleian Library website will sell it to you. I have no idea what the price is, but there's a copy in the SCR, and I keep going back to it and thumbing through it. It's a real treasure. It's beautifully illustrated, and of course, because Nick wrote it, it is beautifully written. It's a genuinely a good book to have in your possession. Nick is a tutorial fellow at St Hugh's. He's also a professor of medieval literature in the University English faculty. He researches into the late medieval period, broadly speaking, and his work includes English poetry and its audiences as well. The poet, the bureaucrat, and the melancholic Thomas Hoccleve, along with his contemporaries and his influences, people like John Lydgate and Geoffrey Chaucer. More recently, I understand he's been studying medieval romance, and in particular how objects and people circulate in romance narratives. As well as Gifts and Books, the latest work, his publications include Medieval Romance and Material Culture, and another book, The Gift of Narrative in Medieval England. And I have in front of me a review which describes this as brilliant and radiant. I can only concur. We would like, as a college, to express to you, to the viewers and listeners, our great gratitude to anybody who's here, but also to those particularly who've made a donation towards the graduate scholarship in English, which is what we advertised when we advertised the booking for tickets for this event. Thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts for supporting this kind of event. All support for academic endeavour in St Hugh's is welcome. We like to target certain events at certain projects, and I think support for English graduate students is utterly appropriate for this kind of event. I will now, with the greatest of pleasure, hand you over to a much more interesting speaker, Nick Perkins.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that really generous introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm sorry in a way that I can't actually see you, but thank you very much for coming. And while I'm sort of just starting to talk, I'm also going to share some slides that I'm going to use as I speak today. So as I say, thank you very much. And yes, what I'm going to talk about today is a project that I've worked on in some form for a very long time. I've been interested for quite a long time in objects, exchange, gift giving, and its relationships to storytelling in medieval literature. And that's come through different forms. For example, a book that I edited about material culture and medieval romance. The monograph that Robert mentioned, which is called The Gift of Narrative in Medieval England, which is kind of really focused on text written in these islands from about the 12th century to the 15th century. And then this broader project, which takes that research and sort of describes it and opens it out, hopefully, to a wider audience and a much broader chronological and sort of geographical span as well. And it's that part of it, which includes an exhibition last year and a book of the exhibition, that I'm going to introduce to you now. So quite a few bits of it, actually, I have to admit to you, hope you were telling Ron, but there's loads of material here that I wasn't really very much of an expert in at all. We're normally supposed to talk about our expertise, but for this project, I really went way out of what you might call a comfort zone or my field, quite unusual in a sense now for an academic, to talk about material that was really old or really contemporary. And I had lots of help from colleagues and the people in the Bodleian to do that. So the overall ideas behind the exhibition and the book that goes along with it were partly to describe and talk about actual books that were gifts. I've got a little example here on the slide at the moment, which is a late medieval or 16th century book with this beautiful image of a man presenting the book to a young lady with a little scroll which says "Prenez en gré," receive this with pleasure. So to talk about books that were gifts. Also to talk about stories that involve gift giving, exchange, and generosity. Now, obviously, not all of those stories are positive or kind of fluffy, warm-hearted stories. You know, the gift can also be a threat. It can also be destructive. It can also impose burdens on people. But we wanted to sort of explore that idea in the exhibition and the book. And then finally, to reflect on the ways in which storytelling itself is a form of gift giving, in the sense that when you tell someone a story, you're opening yourself up to them, you're taking part of yourself and handing it over to them. And normally speaking, then they will reciprocate, and you're setting up a kind of exchange that deepens your relationship. So all of those aspects of giving and exchange are things that, for example, anthropologists have talked about, discussed and debated for a very long time. So around about 100 years ago, that one of the most influential studies of that in anthropology was published, Essai sur le don, usually translated just as the gift, by the scholar Marcel Mauss. So to start with, I'm going to give some examples of the kind of work that the Bodleian actually did with a whole range of people around the exhibition, helping or encouraging people in Oxford and outside to talk about books that were gifts and how that works in their own lives. They use these kind of report cards or discussion cards for people to fill in, and we've got loads and loads of those. I mean, literally thousands of them to think about and sort through. So one was saying, if you were to give a book, what would it be and why? And another was, tell us about a treasured book that you received as a gift. And this brought forward loads of stories from people talking about that. And actually, if any of you would like to say anything about that in your own lives, in your own experience, you'd be really welcome to make a note of a book like that in the chat. Say something about it, or a book that you would want to give to someone. I'd be really interested to see that later on. Here are some examples of some of the stories that came out of that. It was the first classic book given to me by my aunt when I was about 11 or 12. I was put off at first by the cover and dense writing, but when I got around to reading it, it was a gateway into a whole new grown-up world of reading. I always rated my aunt's recommendations after that, and book conversations have been at the heart of our relationship. She treated me like an adult, and I felt respected. Now, I wonder whether you can guess what these books are as they come up. This one is probably unsurprisingly for those for sort of in the English literature world, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. That idea of perhaps one of the first grown-up books that someone might come across in classic fiction. Here's another one. We went to see Joan in concert. As the support act was ill that night, Joan came on and covered. She played for approximately 2.5 hours. That night, I was drawn into the lyrics of Joan's songs, a range of fun and upbeat songs to the thoughtful and moving. I love each page of the book. And this is a collection of lyrics by Joan Armatrading, The Weakness in Me. And finally, here's another example. My mother read the book to my older sister and me before we slept. If we hadn't had the chance to enjoy the story, we wouldn't love the UK so much. We learned a lot about English culture, as well as how and when English people feel happy. This obviously a mystery to a lot of people from outside England, but here is the book. Mary Poppins. And I just I sort of now struggling to think of exactly why that which episodes in the book are about English people feeling happy. A lot of them are about feeling tense or worried or anxious, but I suppose flying a kite would be an example. Okay, so um, it was really great in the project last year to have so much feedback from people either coming to the exhibition or responding to the kind of call outs that Bodleian did. But I'm now going to kind of go back to some of the material that we included in the exhibition and discussed. I won't have very much time. There's so much that I could talk about. So some of the time I'm going to move through quite quickly, but we might be able to come back in the Q&A and say a few other things about them. So here's perhaps the oldest thing that was in our exhibition and that's discussed in the book of the exhibition in a really beautiful chapter by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who's based in Exeter University and is a scholar of biblical history and ancient religion. So here's a tablet. It's sort of something that you could hold in the palm of your hand. It's inscribed using cuneiform script, and it comes from the ancient Sumerian culture. The inscription, broadly speaking, could be translated as, "For the god Ningirsu, mighty hero of the god Enlil, his lord. Shulgi, mighty man, king of Ur, king of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, built his temple of Bagara for him." What's really intriguing about this, so a very early example of, of written inscription, is that it is, I'm going to describe it as a gift tag. Some of you over Christmas time might have wrapped up a present and written a tag and put it on. Well, this is a gift tag in stone form. And the present, the gift that's being given, is a temple. So this tablet inscribes not only like that the building is a gift, but to my mind also inscribes and develops an ongoing relationship between the king and the gods, between the people and gods generally. The tablet was buried underneath the entranceway to the temple. So it wasn't on display, but the idea of it, I think, is that this tablet would have been speaking out all the time, reminding the god of the gift and an obligation, I suppose, or a slight hint to return that favor to people. And that kind of relationship of gift and exchange crosses over all sorts of religions. And in the exhibition, we featured a number of those. And there's a short chapter in our book which mostly talks about Buddhist texts and gifts. By an expert in that field who worked at the Bodleian. Okay, so now I'm going to move on a little bit to an area which I know slightly more about, medieval European culture. So here's an example of a page from a book that we featured in our exhibition. It's known as the Abingdon Missal. And it was created for the Abbey of Abingdon, just down the road from Oxford. It was written in the 1460s and may well have been written and illuminated here in Oxford. As you can see, and the picture doesn't really do justice to the book in person. It's absolutely gorgeous and also in a way terrifying image here on this page, an image of the crucifixion. Here's the answering page. So this is a full opening that we see of the book here. And one of the things that it's doing is it's describing, the central moment, I suppose, of Christian religion as a moment of gift, sacrifice, and potential return. Christ's gift to people in the sense of giving himself as a sacrifice. And you can see at the top of the left-hand page there, God in that sort of cloud, opening his hands as if he sort of were giving this too. Down at the bottom of that left-hand page, we see the man who paid for this manuscript. He's called William Ashenden, and he was the abbot of Abingdon at that time. So because of his donation, he gets to be close to Christ. He gets to be able to have his prayer answered. So the book is both, of course, a genuine expression of piety, but it is also a way for Ashenden to promote himself and make sure that he's right in there when these discussions are being had. I'm just going to show you a little detail from the right-hand page as well, because on that page, the illustration there shows a story from the Old Testament, the story of Abraham and Isaac. And Christian theologians regarded that as a kind of preview of the sacrifice of Christ for or by his father God. So in the story, Abraham nearly sacrifices his son and then is prevented. Okay, I'm just going to show you that those images. I've just got a few details here on this page. So there at the top is a close-up of that story of Abraham and Isaac, and you can see the little red angel there sort of staying Abraham's hand and pointing down to the animal that's going to be sacrificed instead. And there's William Ashenden looking at his best and very pious. So a manuscript like this contains a number of quite complex messages about gift giving, about exchange, about sacrifice. And in fact, on the right-hand page that I showed you, that's the middle of the service of Mass in the Catholic Church. And the priest at that moment is calling the bread and wine of the Mass gifts that they are offering to God. So there's a huge amount of different dynamics which are intermingling on that one page. Just something that we didn't manage to get into the book because the book had to be ready well before the exhibition opened. And the opportunity to show this picture came up much later on. The Bodleian acquired this absolutely gorgeous picture, which I'm just going to show you because it's so beautiful. And also, of course, is another moment of important gift giving. Here, the three magi visiting the baby Christ and offering gifts to him. I don't know whether we're still in the season of Epiphany, but it's certainly relevant to that. I've got a couple of close-ups here, and the picture uses a tradition that was developing in the late 15th, early 16th century of showing the three magi, the three kings, coming from three different continents. The old man representing Europe, a middle-aged man, the bearded one there representing Asia, and the young king there, a black African. And these beautiful portraits of them are so detailed that it's really worth sort of delving in closer and having a look at those. They're all gazing at Christ and at Mary. But I think it's still significant that the European king gets to go closest to the Christ child, even to touch his toes and sort of gaze most closely at him there. Okay, so I'm going to change the tune a bit. And because I teach medieval English literature, I'm going to read a little bit of Chaucer with you. Geoffrey Chaucer, one of our greatest writers in English, living in the late 1300s. Chaucer died in 1400. And his most famous work is the Canterbury Tales, this story collection of pilgrims traveling from London to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, where they're going to give gifts to the shrine and hope for some kind of benefits as well. One of the tales that's told, and a tale-telling competition is really also a gift exchange, I suppose you could argue, or at least an exchange, even if it's competitive. One of the tales that's told is told by a summoner, a kind of ecclesiastical debt collector. And he has a row with a friar who's also traveling. So another sort of, I suppose, ecclesiastical figure, not quite a monk, someone who wanders around. And so the summoner wants to get his own back on the friar. And he tells a story about a corrupt friar who's always telling people they're going to go to hell unless they give him money. He goes to the house of a man who's sick and lying in bed, and he tries to chat up the wife and goes on and on about how wonderful he is and how the prayers of friars are powerful. And he goes in to speak to the man, who's a bit wise to him. So I think he's called John, the man who's lying sick in bed. He says to this friar, and I'm going to read the Middle English, but I put a translation alongside. He says, "No, then, put in the hand, do me back," said this man, "and grope her well behind her. Beneath me buttock, there shalt thou find a thing that ye have hid in privity." "Ah," thought this friar, "that shall go well with me." And down his hand he launcheth to the clift, in hope for to find there a gift. And I love the way that Chaucer manages to rhyme cleft of his arse with gift at that moment. He's sort of mingling the value of the gift that the friar hopes to expect and where it's actually going to come from. So the friar's hoping for some money. He thinks the man's hiding a money bag perhaps underneath him in bed to keep it safe. But it's not exactly what he expects. And when the sick man felt this friar about his tool grope here and there and here, amid his hand he let the friar a fart. There nis no couple, drawing in a cart that micht have let a fart a switch as soon. The friar up stareth as doth a wood leon. Ah, false churl, quod he, for God is bonus. This hast thou for despite done for the noners. Thou shalt be this fart, if that he may. So I'm going to pay you back for this fart, the friar says. The rest of the tale has a very long description and kind of meditation on how exactly the fart might be divided amongst the friar and his fellow friars. It involves a cartwheel and all sorts of other things as well, which won't go into. But what I'm really interested in here, and although it's fun, it's Chaucerian kind of low bodily comedy. There's also a serious point that Chaucer's making, that the language that the friar is using, if it's not backed up by reality, his claims to prayer and to salvation, they are just wind, they're just hot air. And he's making that into a material object through the kind of comment, you could call it, that this man makes on the friar. So in this case, it's a gift, it's a comment, it's satire. It's actually quite a serious political point as well about how people in authority can trick poor people out of their money, or in some cases out of eternal life as well. There's a lot more we could say about Chaucer and his relationship to giving and exchange, but I'm going to move on now. So you might be relieved to know that we're kind of moving much more into a more refined area now. I'm just going to show this book very, very quickly because it's one of the most sort of resonant and beautiful books that we showed in our exhibition, and I think in the Bodleian at all. This is a book that was made by Queen Elizabeth I when she was a child. She translated a French devotional text. She copied it out carefully at age 11 in sort of careful handwriting. She almost certainly also made this beautiful cover, which she stitched with gold and silver thread. And on the front, she's stitched KP for Catherine Parr, her stepmother. And she gave it to Catherine for a New Year's gift in 1545. That's an example of the beginning of the text there. So Elizabeth here, obviously she's giving a nice gift to her stepmother, but there's also religion, there's politics, there's kind of negotiation and exchange in the Tudor court, which are really, really important here too. And the resonance of this text, it was really amazing. When people sort of came to see it in the exhibition, there's a real aura around it that people felt. Okay, around about the time when Elizabeth was on the throne, then there was the sense that the Bodleian, or the Oxford University, needed to re-establish and put on a better footing its library. And Thomas Bodley, a sort of courtier and so on in Elizabeth's court, became the person who did that. And that's why the Bodleian Library is named the Bodleian, after Thomas Bodley. Now, when the Bodleian got established, Bodley had the idea of having a great big book that people who gave money to the library would be honoured in. And there are different pages here which are dedicated to different donors to the Bodleian, from the Archbishop of Canterbury down. It's known as the Donors Register. And it was on display in the Bodleian. It and its sort of following on volumes were on display in the Bodleian, actually for hundreds of years, where visitors could come and see and sort of be encouraged to donate as well. So Bodley was sort of ahead of his time in the sense of development and, honouring donors and making sure that people sort of felt part of this big, broad project of scholarship and research that he was very much engaged with. Now, in the exhibition, we chose a page of the donors register with a donation by a woman called Catherine Sands, which you can see there on the slide. The date at the top is 1607. And It says here, Lady Catherine Sands, the wife of Edwin Sands of London, a knight, she gave £20 to the library, and then they list the books that were bought with that donation. The first thing in the list is 8 books in Chinese. And it's a really interesting donation, and the books, they're still there in the Bodleian. I'm going to give you a look at one of them here. um, Quite unusually, um, they survive where a lot of books of their sort, fairly cheap publications from that early 17th century, haven't survived. And so the Bodleian has a really important collection of early Chinese books. But at the time when this donation was given, Bodley and the other librarians couldn't read Chinese. In fact, they wrote, or one of the scribes that Bodley used wrote "Gift of Lady Catherine Sands" on what they thought was the front cover of the book, but it was actually the back cover, because they didn't even know which way to read the book. So it wasn't until later in the 1600s when a Chinese scholar, Shen Fuzhong, came to Oxford, was paid by the then librarian to look into the Chinese books. And he helped the librarian to understand what they were, to transcribe the titles of them, and to help to catalogue the books. So in a sense, that gift lay almost dormant, you could say, for several decades, until the scholarship of this Chinese man came and helped the library to understand the books that they actually had. And they're now a really interesting, sort of important resource. Okay, so I'm now going to jump a few centuries because I'm conscious of time. I'm going to go to the middle of the 1800s and to a book that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, especially with Christmas having just gone. This is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. What I've got on the slide here is one of the Bodleian's copies of the first edition of Christmas Carol. And we can see it's got a lovely, lively, what we call frontispiece illustration here as well by John Leach. Christmas Carol is obviously a ghost story. It's a story about generosity and the lack of generosity. But as the quotation on the slide also suggests, the book was itself a so-called gift book. It was designed for the Christmas market to be sold and given as a gift. And that's something that I think is really interesting about reading it, that Dickens is well aware both of the idea of giving and what comes when you do give, what doesn't come, or the dangers of not giving. He's really well aware of that inside the story, but he also works it into and is aware of the whole role of his book as a whole, as a gift object that might nurture relationships between people. He didn't know that this book would become so hugely popular. And I think I'm right in saying that he sold the rights to the book in one go at the beginning, and then didn't really benefit very much from the subsequent popularity of it. So I've got a close up there of that lovely illustration of Mr. Fezziwig, who, if you remember The Ghost of Christmas Past, takes Scrooge to see himself as a young man in this household where generosity, laughter, dancing, spending money, but on other people, was really important. And Fezziwig is at the heart of that. In her chapter for our book, Faith Binks talks about this, describes the relationships of giving, exchange, memory, and the way in which the story of Scrooge kind of reaches out to readers as well. Here's another example, which we included in our exhibition. So this edition of Christmas Carol from the early 20th century has illustrations by the famous illustrator Arthur Rackham, much more gloomy and foreboding here. And of course, this is a moment of the text where in the future, Scrooge sees the possibility of his own death. And these two men in the foreground say, "Old Scratcher's got his own at last," i.e. the devil's going to take Scrooge. I've got a lovely quote here from my colleague Ushishi Dasgupta about Dickens and the way that he was meditating and thinking about gift giving all the time through his career. Dickens wanted his readers to do something with the real and metaphorical gifts they'd received, she says, in thinking about Christmas Carol, but a lot of his other work as well. And I think that relationship between writer and readers is a really important one in many of the books that we picked up on and used both in our exhibition and in our own book. Okay. So here's an example of what our exhibition actually looked like. I feel quite sad about this because it was such a big part of my life, and obviously exhibitions come and go, but we do have a lovely photographic record of it. And actually, this is the part of the exhibition which has a lot of so-called Victorian gift books, including Christmas Carol in the centre, and some other materials around that as well. If we were in that exhibition space and if we turned round, we'd have seen another case which mainly focused on children's and young writing for young people from the 18th, 19th century right to the present day. So one famous example was Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince, a story all about generosity and its lack, and sort of learning from that, and almost an extreme of generosity. Another much more contemporary story which we featured is this one, The Ghost in the Castle by Zeta Elliott. And that photograph is of Zeta herself, who came and spoke at an event that we had. One of the things that her work and some of the other more contemporary work I think is really interesting to show is writers for young people also showing those young people, showing those children doing something themselves. So although children are often the receivers of gifts in society, here in these contemporary stories, they also become agents, they become givers, they can change the world for the better. And in this story, the two young protagonists, Zaria and Winston. She's visiting from America. Winston is a Black British boy who lives in South London and is her cousin. They buy a cloth and some other materials to kind of to give to a ghost that they've met in Windsor Castle, who's associated with an infamous moment of colonial history, the so-called Napier expedition of the 19th century. And he's an Ethiopian prince, Alamehu, who was taken to Victorian England after this. So he's a historical figure, but this is a fictional account that sort of helps to think through these difficult issues of colonial history and to kind of resolve in a fantasy world some of those problems and issues which are still ongoing. Okay, and so just for the last couple of minutes of the talk, I want to say a little bit about how some of those ideas sort of went out into the projects that we did alongside the exhibition. So when I first started speaking, and Robert, when he was introducing me, he was mentioning that I work on late medieval literature, and I've written, a kind of academic monograph about all of this. And what's been really interesting and sort of fun for me is to see how that very, in a sense, very detailed specialist work can, over a long line of material and the exhibition and our projects, end up with engaging with people right here and now in Oxford. So one of the projects we did, I got some money for something called a Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. And I worked with artist Dion Freeman, who's there in the photo on the slide. We worked with young people who were in hospital and receiving some schooling there because they're long-term sick. With some students at a school in East Oxford, Oxford Spires Academy, and with older people who are recuperating, usually from an operation in the city community hospital. And between them, they worked on canvases and objects inspired by stories from the exhibition. And the objects and canvases moved from one group to another. And each group then worked more and more on the same items. And so, in a sense, they were giving a gift to one another and having a conversation through that process. They couldn't meet, partly because there were still some COVID restrictions when we started, but also because they were unwell. But they managed to communicate really amazingly through that. And this art was on display alongside our exhibition. So that was one project that we did. Another here, which I really loved, was working with some primary schools in East Oxford, and with the author Patience Agbarbi, who's in the centre of the photo there. Now, Patience is an Oxford graduate, a really brilliant poet. She did a fantastic contemporary version of the Canterbury Tales, for example, called Telling Tales. And she also writes children's books. So Patience and I worked with the kids in schools. They came to the exhibition. They thought about gifts. They wrote material about it, including sort of riddles and poems about the objects in our exhibition. And we're pictured there with one of their teachers. And there was just a lot of creativity that sort of came back from that. So here I've got an example of the anthology that we managed to create through that, which we call the gift of writing. If you cast your mind back to MS Cherry 36, the book that Elizabeth made for her stepmother, Catherine Parr, there's a drawing of it from one of the children and a kind of riddling text about it. I was made by a princess for a queen. I'm stitched KP with gold thread. I'm light teal like the Caribbean Sea, and I've gold sparkles like the sun. I was handed to a queen from a princess. So lovely imaginative writing, which touches on some of the kind of mystery of gift giving, as well as just the beauty of the objects as well. So thank you very much for listening to this kind of run through some of the ideas which are part of our the exhibition project, and many of which are described and discussed in the book that I put there on the slide. So I've edited it, but there are various other people from Oxford and beyond who are much more expert than I am in those particular fields, who've written on different aspects of our project. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to stop sharing the screen and see if I can hand over. And if anyone's got questions, you'd be really welcome to come up with them.
So thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's so fascinating to hear about the different ways of thinking about gifts and books, and as well as those amazing community projects there that you showed us too. So for anyone that doesn't know me, hello, my name's Jenny Wood. I'm the Head of Alumni Relations and Stewardship here at St Hugh's, and I'll be helping put your questions that are coming through in the Q&A to Nick so that he can get to those. Just before we get to the questions, I just wanted to read out a couple of the stories about books that have come through in the chat that you called out for just at the beginning of the session. So we had one come through from our senior tutor who said, my most treasured book gift is the first edition of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, left to me in my German tutor's will. It is quite literally the most precious book I have. So some real sentimental value in books there. Another one that's come in from Elise Page says, one of my favorite book gifts is the copy of Beowulf. Anora, also from the 2015 English St Hugh's matriculation group, gave me for my birthday after we graduated. I can't remember the author, but it's the one with the illustrations, the Blob Grendel. I think you know the one because I'm pretty sure you told us about it, is what she says.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Hello, Elise. Lovely. I was going to say lovely to see you, but I can't see you. But it's really nice that you come and listen. Yes, and I think both of those examples are really great about certainly in an academic world. Sometimes books obviously are often like the carriers of our ideas as well. So they're both a personal gift, but they also, you know, allow us to bring our thinking forward and to sort of say something or experience something about the way in which academic work in all different fields is really this continuing chain of passing on ideas, you know, and knowledge from one, sometimes individually from one scholar to another, more often, I suppose, from groups or sets of ideas or so on from one to another. I'm really conscious of that in my own work of learning from previous generations of scholars, and obviously work has to kind of be new and it has to sort of contribute something, but I think it can also rethink and honor the work of previous scholars as well. And yes, I do know about the blob, Grendel. We had a lot of fun with that later on. There are some amazing sort of different versions of Beowulf. Yeah, fantastic.
Brilliant. So I can see we've had a few people putting some questions in the Q&A box, and if anybody else while we're talking has a question for Nick, please do put it in that box and we'll read them out. So there were a couple that came in around the Dickens section of your talk. Monica Kendall says, I think this rosy picture of Dickens and gift giving is rather spoiled by the probability that it was a cynical ploy by the publishers to make a lot of money and not to pay Dickens much at all. So interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. We have another kind of similar question I might read out at the same time so that you've got kind of a broad picture of where people are thinking on this. Cameron Marnock says, Victorian magazine, the new monthly magazine, were actually critical of A Christmas Carol's first edition, saying that for a book about charity to the poor, the full colour illustrations priced out poorer readers. Did you explore the differences between gifts aimed at the wealthy compared to gifts focused on lower class or stations?
Yeah, and hello, Cameron. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for those. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think anything involving Dickens, there are messages on multiple different levels in his work, and obviously, Christmas Carol initially might come across as something which has, it has a headline message, and it's become in our own culture something that perhaps the complexities of it have been dampened down a bit in the way that we, in the run up to Christmas and so on, use it. But yeah, absolutely. Dickens and any author both might have ideas and ideals about what they want, where they want to go, what they want to do, but there's often a gap between that ideal relationship, say between text and audience, or between text and the kind of philosophical or ethical ideas in it, and just business. And we all know that Dickens, is a really, to some extent, like very complicated, very problematic personality, and the networks that he's moving in. I think it's right to think about publishing authors as sort of part of a network of publishing, writing, audiences, what they needed, and so on. So I think it's absolutely right to say Christmas Carol and any book doesn't exist kind of in a vacuum and can't be suddenly sort of magicked up. So in the exhibition, yes, we did explore some much more sort of, I suppose, much cheaper versions of texts that were aimed, including sort of really, really scrappy old, tiny little book from the late 18th century, which had different versions of fairy stories including a version of Cinderella. The book was called The Gift, but as I was saying, I mean, you could probably hold it in your hand about that big. So just for, a few coins, they are still selling the idea of generosity and giving and transformation, but to a much different market. I think the Victorian period is really interesting. I'm not an expert in it at all, but it's really interesting how during that period, there's a real development, obviously, of publishing technology, of different levels, if you like, of audience. So you could find books that were printed at different levels and for different, I suppose you could say, grades of money and audience. So the Arthur Rackham version that I showed you was even more exclusive, you could say, really beautifully bound, very small numbers of print. But Dickens's work then subsequently became available in much cheaper editions too.
Brilliant. So with questions are coming in thick and fast now, so I'll put a few more to you if that's all right. We also just have a note here from Monica, one of our other original question askers, saying, just a note, the PhD thesis was written by Carol Chataway at UCL in the 90s on gift giving in the medieval Burgundian court. So I'm wondering if that's something that you were aware of.
No, fantastic. I will go.
Together.
Yeah, I'll go and I'll go and have a look at that. That sounds really really interesting.
So we have here another question from Sally Kettle saying, St. Hugh's being the location of the China Centre, do the academics and students there use the Chinese books donated to the Bodleian by Catherine Sanders?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think the answer to that specific donation would be no. And the reason for that is that those books are published in the 1500s, some of those. They're very fragile. And you'd have to go to the rare books reading room to look at them for conservation purposes and security. And now that the Bodleian has the Western Library, you know, the kind of rare books library that's been rebuilt, what we all used to call the New Bodleian. That is an area which is sort of much more suited to look at these older and really fragile materials. But you know, I go down into the Bodleian, like the China Library of the Bodleian, quite a bit in the basement of our building at the China Centre. And I often call up books from the Bodleian bookstore to use there. Our St. Hughes students really benefit from having a Bodleian library right here on the St. Hughes site. And there are lots of students and scholars working on Chinese material who do work in that library.
Brilliant. So another fascinating question here from Elise saying, I like the idea of gifts as a blessing or a curse. I recently saw it framed as knowledge as cognito hazard, when knowing something can be actively dangerous. Can a story, perhaps hiding allegories of controversial religious ideas in the medieval England, be seen in this way, or even bound up in the obligations that can come with a gift? I have to read this because it was a gift, even if having this idea makes me a target for persecution.
Wow. Yeah. I think different kinds of texts and in different periods, you know, some of these texts have dangerous ideas in them. And you can use the language of gift in order to in order perhaps to get round otherwise things that might block the progress of a text into the hands of readers, or that might block the progress of an idea, you know, into the minds of readers or listeners. And certainly I mean Elise there, they mention medieval texts, and so in my own experience, I think that's absolutely right, that you can use a kind of rhetoric of, well, I'm giving you this precious gift, I want you to do something with it, or using or adapting sort of biblical ideas about it, that it's your duty almost to give knowledge or to correct errors that you see in people's minds. And so a text will often say, well, it's really important for me to sort of to do this and to hand this over to you. Obviously, in the medieval period especially, books are very, very often gift objects themselves. They're not mass market productions. You mostly have to write them by hand. They're really expensive. And so a book, naturally speaking, if you like, is also a gift too. Now, obviously, there's a slightly different relationship, we could argue, between mass market books and the gift. But nevertheless, people are still, as we all know, they're still finding ways to make books available and to make them a little bit special, not just a commodity purchase, but something that has a definite direction and a sort of a way into people as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. So a question here from Scylla saying, did your exhibition, which she says she regrets she was unable to come and see, did the exhibition consider dedications in books and their significance?
Now that is a really good question. And the answer is a bit, but not perhaps as much as I initially wanted to, as I initially thought. And it's a really interesting thing to sort of think back to an exhibition project. When you're doing an exhibition, you have to have like loads of ideas about all sorts of different ways to do things. And many of them just end up on the floor. You know, you can't do everything. So one idea that we had at one point with the exhibition was to have a whole donation of books to the Bodleian by one of its major donors, say in the 17th or 18th century, and just put them all there on display as a kind of great big sort of block of books. And it was a nice idea, but then we've got loads of complaints from readers who actually wanted to read the books during the, and you can't get them out of the display during the exhibition. So we then thought about like photographing a whole rank of those books and putting them on. But really, we wanted to be able to tell stories with each of the objects. So I did look at quite a lot of books with dedications and thought about telling some of those. And some of the books that we did display do have those. But on the whole, we didn't end up really featuring that. And instead, we wanted to tell different kinds of stories with each book, but often they did also have interesting dedications. And with a lot of, especially earlier books, the sort of dedication material kind of becomes part of the text as well. Like with the book that we saw written by Elizabeth when she was a child, the first text page of the book kind of is both the entry into the book that we're reading, and it is also a kind of dedication. It's a kind of dedicatory letter or epistle. And authors were really adept at sort of including that inside the text that they were writing as well. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Obviously, the Bodleian has lots of really fascinating examples of books that were also dedicated to individual people. One little example, which again didn't make it into the book of the exhibition because we were still kind of trying to work out whether it was possible, is a lovely book that we featured written by Christina Rossetti. It's a little book of nursery rhymes, poems that she wrote called, I think it's called Sing Song, is that right? And she dedicated that copy to her mother. So there's a lovely inscription to her mother, and she's added some translations of the text into Italian and also some extra verses. Now, that little book, I happened to find out about it because it belongs to a descendant of Christina Rossetti, who is the cousin of the father of a friend. And so I managed to sort of get it, and he was willing to lend it to us. But we only sort of were negotiating that while the exhibition was kind of, coming together.
Brilliant. And speaking of books coming through family, we have a comment here from Rosemary Cook that says, not a question, but a book I like is The Book of Gnomes. The pictures are really detailed and fascinating, written by Fred E. Weatherly and illustrated by E. Stuart Darby. It originally belonged to my mother. We have another question here from Cameron Marnock saying, did you consider different permanencies of gifts? For example, an exhibit is a gift to a community that will last a much shorter time, books as more permanent gifts than many others.
Yeah, no, that I think again, Cameron, that's a really interesting question to think about. And from my own perspective, doing this like broader project, I think it was really important to do some of each thing. So and I think this is something that in the sort of university environment and scholarship, we are I don't know if you can hear, that's Professor Mitchell's dogs just going past my office. I don't know if you hear the barking. But in the university environment, perhaps we tend to think of what in the sort of university world are called outputs, which normally are books or academic articles or whatever, as being the thing that will survive. But I really believe, and I want to sort of hang on to the idea that actually the idea in a child's mind that they could write a poem, or that it's fine for them to go to Oxford and go to the Bodleian and have ideas about an exhibition. Many of the children from the primary schools that we worked with in East Oxford hardly ever come to Oxford because they live in Cowley and it's a bus ride away, and they don't think that Oxford is for the likes of them. And so doing that and sort of encouraging them and saying, yeah, you can write, you can do this. Look, here's your work in a book. And we printed this book and we've given a copy back to every child who took part in our project. We just don't know, but I hope and believe that could be really important and long lasting. You never know whether someone, there was a child who put their hand up and said, I want to be a writer. How do I go about it? I'm starting to write books already. But I think that is really important. And I want to sort of encourage that alongside the sort of academic publishing and the idea of a book being a permanent sort of monument, as it were. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got 4 minutes left in our session. So I wonder if there's very, very quickly, you could tell us what was your favorite item in the exhibition or the book that you put together around gifts and books? And is there one that stood out that was your favorite?
Yeah, no, that is a really difficult question. And obviously it was something that I got asked quite a bit. So I should have been prepared for this question, Jenny. But when the exhibition was on, I spent a lot of time going in there, sort of showing around different groups of all kinds. And yeah, it was a question that often came up, what was my favorite item? And I would always say, I would look around the room and say, well, my favorite item today is, and then I'd sort of pick up something. So I'm gonna, it's really impossible. I'm gonna choose two very quickly, if that's okay. One is sort of big and one is fairly small. So the big one, which I write a little bit about in the book of the exhibition, actually didn't come from Oxford. It was one of the loan items that we had. It's called the Horn of Ulf, and it belongs to York Minster. It was supposedly given to the Minster in the 1030s by a Scandinavian nobleman, Ulf, at the same time as donating some land. And it's a really magnificent horn. It started life on an elephant. It's elephant ivory, and it was traded to Europe and magnificently carved. And that was really, it was a really inspiring object that actually the children who took part in our project really loved. And the other item, which I always sort of came back to just because of its kind of liveliness as well, is a book associated in a little bit with St. Hugh's, actually. It's called the Women's Suffrage Cookery Book. And it was put together with kind of donated recipes, I suppose you could say, from women who supported the suffrage cause, and became a kind of anthology of recipes, produced in, I think, about 1912, something like that. It's really tatty, falling apart. And it belonged to a pair of sisters whose surname was Denneker sisters, one of whom had some links, connections with St. Hugh's. I think she taught at St. Hugh's for a while, and the other of whom had connections with Lady Margaret Hall. And they lived just around the corner in North Oxford. And it's got notes, little recipes on scraps of paper, all sorts of things like falling out of it. But I think it's a really beautiful and sort of telling example of these women from all over the country coming together and donating things for a larger cause.
Lovely. I mean, I'm glad you said that. That's what stood out to me as well when I went
Right.
to the exhibition. I think because of the St. Hugh's connection and just seeing.
Yeah, I had to have an item that had a real good St. Hugh's connection in there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that is bringing us to the end of our time. So all that remains for me to say is a huge thank you to you, Nick, for giving your time for us for this lecture. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I know that we've had so much comments and thank yous coming in from the people watching along at home as well. So thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for coming along today. We've really appreciated having you here, and thank you to, again, I know Robert said it earlier, but thanks to everyone who's given to the English Graduate Scholarship Fund as part of your attendance. And do look out for an email from us later on today with a quick survey just letting us know what you thought of the session. But yes, all that remains to say is thank you, Nick, and thanks to everyone, and have a good rest of your day.